Thank you so much, Kanchi and Bharat Bhai. Um, I want to open up for questions, but before I do that, I just want to take a minute and just share a very personal experience with with some of the things that have been spoken about at this panel. So actually, I am writing my doctoral dissertation as a legal history of the fundamental right to property in the Indian Constitution, and so vast is this subject that's why perhaps I haven't finished, and but hopefully will finish soon. And I was 4 years back when I had just started working on my dissertation is when I went and worked in Mundra. And it became clear very quickly that there was so much that was not covered within the domain of the fundamental right to property. So, and I think what is really interesting about this panel is that it has brought out the layers and the complexity of these issues. So, on the one hand, we have questions of individual versus communal property ownership. So the fundamental right to property only guaranteed an individual right to property, and it doesn't really protect communal property in that sense. And in Mundra, the way the stakeholders have rights. This was not even, and this was interesting because it's not even like communal land ownership or resources under the soil like it is in the case of Meghalaya, but just the waters, the common property resources of the seas, really, where there was reclamation of land and the creation of ports. So there's various kinds of property rights that we are talking about here, and there's a lot of complexity surrounding that. The second thing that came out was just the way the government sort of regulates various lands. So Mr. Mehta's presentation, where you're talking about land that comes under the forest department may not necessarily have this doesn't have the same legal framework applicable as opposed to the revenue lands, even though people living in those forest lands are pretty much cultivating it like what it would be in the revenue lands. So there is that issue, and this idea, and this goes back again to the assertion of, because many of these problems are sort of carryovers from the colonial period, in the sense that the colonial government, just as it asserted the right of the state to mineral resources under the soil, it also asserted the right to forest land and to common land
and forests
and to forests. So it kind of dates back to that. But I think what's also very interesting is the role of law and the role of courts in this process, because what we see is that on the one hand, legal regulation, so there are two stages, right? One is at the level of regulation, and then of course at the level of implementation. But even at the level of regulation, it seems that law is being used by both parties. So it's being used as a mechanism of suppression of some of these traditional communities, but it is also being proving to be an enabling mechanism with the Forest Rights Act. So, and I think that's very interesting. And what is also interesting is how much the people are using the courts, even if the judgments and the processes haven't really been as successful as it should be. I mean, this is a very positive example, but at least my experience with the Mundra cases and from what I've seen has been that courts haven't been as the stays haven't come through as easily as you would expect in construction. So as a young lawyer, when I reached Mundra, and you believe in the power of the law and the courts, and we went to see the mangrove forest that we were trying to protect, and it had already been cut, and that was what we were going to fight about. So I think it's very interesting to see what role the courts are also playing in this process, and I was hoping that the panelists could speak more about that. But I'll open it up for questions now, and maybe you can reflect on some of these points as you address the questions. Kavita?
I have just one question. Namita, you mentioned
Since Namita, you mentioned the role of courts, I was just wondering, what about the costs of justice in this? Because we are really talking about the poor and the marginalized. So maybe just a little bit on that from either from the panelists, or since Namita is also quite aware of the work. Thank you.
What would you mean by costs?
Basically, the fees and access and all other costs involved in that, starting the legal process itself.
So somebody else?
अभी तक आपको बताऊं कि हम लोगों ने काफ़ी सारी खाली ओपीजी केस को लेके करीबन 8 जितनी पिटीशन हुई एनजीटी में, हाई कोर्ट में, वो सब मिला के। उसके सिवा अदानी पे वो तो ठीक है कि लोकली सपोर्ट मिलता है, यहाँ पे दिल्ली लेवल पे जो सपोर्ट मिलता है उसकी वजह से चला पा रहे वो है। पर अभी तक का जो व्यू रहा है कि लास्ट में क्या होता है तो कुछ मिलता नहीं है, मतलब लोगों को कुछ नहीं मिलता जो जिसके लिए फाइट कर रहे हैं। हाँ, उसमें कुछ कॉम्प्रोमाइज़ वो सब हुआ है, जैसे कि ओपीजी ने वो एयरकूल टेक्नोलॉजी में गया, या अदानी पे अभी फाइन लगा, प्रेशर क्रिएट होता है, जो मैंग्रोव काटता था वो नहीं काटता, मतलब अभी बंद हो गया, अभी वहीं पे ख़त्म हुआ है, दूसरी जगह पे अभी चालू किया उसने। जैसे कि कंडला में अभी नया जो कंडला का प्रोजेक्ट है तो उसमें उसने काटना शुरू भी किया, मुंद्रा वाला एरिया में बंद किया। तो उस तरह की इम्पैक्ट हुई है, और ये सब प्रेशर की वजह से वो CSR में ज़्यादा मतलब खर्च करने लगे हैं। बाकी कुछ जो होना था वो तो हुआ है, कंट्रोल नहीं हुआ है।
I think what he was basically trying to say, just a quick translation, is that there have been different things that people have tried out at different levels. Much of it has not been necessarily successful, but it has also it has put pressure on. I mean, on the project authorities there to invest much more in corporate social responsibility. Just to quickly add to what he was saying. I think there are two different kinds of litigations that are emerging from the area. Those which are questioning the regulatory processes, which are questioning impact assessments, ecological destruction. However, there is enough and more litigation from the area which is basically has two sides to it. One, which are individual driven. So they are talking about regaining control over lost land, which is individual driven. There is also litigation that is emerging from the area, which is motivated. So people are negotiating best prices, etc., from the area. So in terms of costs, I think it gets borne differently in either one of these cases.
But Forest Rights Act, the costs were not much. Litigation costs were not much because basically the lawyers just fought the case without charging us more. Otherwise, given the numbers, bearing the cost would not have been much difficult because 1,20,000 claimants who really benefited from this judgment. If the cost was distributed to them, it would have supported. But we did not go for it because the lawyers were willing to fight for us without charging us. So, and the administrative cost, nothing much more.
Just a quick point on this, while the courts and the legal process is very critical, it's also important to understand that judiciary does not give out verdicts written in stone. And if the society and the politics do not endorse it, the judicial verdict won't count for much. The Singur Tata case is a very good example where virtually every stage in the judicial process, the Tatas won the case. But they lost Singur. So what we mean is that, the judicial verdict and the processes are important, but it should be understood in a proper context. Judiciary should not be seen as something that they can have a magic wand and resolve their challenges.
I have a question for the panel, specifically related to the FRA, the use of the GPS. I was part of this committee by the two ministries, the MOEF and the Tribal Affairs. And we had gone into we had a lot of discussion on how things should be surveyed. And we also visited the field. Now, was there no error when you used the GPS?
Errors would be there. Point is that if you wait for DILR surveys, they would never happen. GPS is an instrument which gives instant access to the villagers. They themselves can operate and carry out the survey in a very less time. That is one thing. Errors can be corrected. We got initial error, and we are not aiming at 100% accuracy. 10%, 5% accuracy, loss of accuracy is okay with us. And we are plotting, all the plots are adjacent to each other, and you are superimposing GPS data on the satellite imageries. So you correct. Then we correct it by the imagery. Looking at the imagery, we correct the plots, we correct the overlaps. Because there would be overlap. People are walking, so adjacent fields, there would be overlaps. All those things get corrected. So by what we want, you can easily get. And what we are interested in, what was the situation of this land in 2005.
Okay, and yeah, then the next level of question is to all of us. The point here is that when it comes to survey of land, the cadastral survey is the best, or all station survey as it's called today, using these instruments is the best, where you can map even a blade of grass and everything. The reason I am raising this is when you look at land being allocated to industries, it's very clear. It's pakka. You cannot play, even an inch this way or that way. And so they build their compound walls and their fences. When it comes to the people, the government deliberately is leaving this ambiguity, and it is not right. See, the thing is that today you are there or today I am there. When we are not there or somebody else is not there to adjudicate, land, the boundary disputes are the worst. That actually can lead families into fjords and various things. So my point is that the government should be serious and do a proper survey and demarcate areas clearly so that in future there is no ambiguity to it. I mean, I agree with the great work you have done, and I understand the use of certain technology and certain instruments on behalf of people for a claim. That definitely is a very good aspect. And but overall, when we leave it like this, like say government of Andhra Pradesh, if you see the list, it will say that we are on the top of distribution. But at the field level, the reality at the field is totally different. One. Second question, which is again back to the panel, is, see, when you said that this FRA is a kind of a property, it is not. It is not. It is just a conditional patta, and actually the government is putting the headache of managing the forest and everything on the people who actually are not responsible for it. The whole destruction is happening from this side, from this end. So these are the 2 points that I have.
Just one quick on this issue of the accuracy, because this was an issue we had debated a number of times, including the very fact of using a GPS or using a smartphone which can do the GPS. This is evidence, not title. If the government has the capacity and is really serious, they are free to send their DLR to do the survey. The challenge is, and we asked many people, including people in the revenue and the ISRO satellite agencies who can do the ground truthing, that today the environment has become so hostile for the fear of acquisition that outside agencies, including government agencies, going in to do a general survey is looked upon suspiciously. So what we are seeking is, instead of waiting forever for the state to come in, this is something that is visible to everybody. Recognize it, at least recognize it with a condition that it will refer to future correction if necessary, because in Andhra Pradesh, and that was one of our early interaction when we went to Andhra Pradesh to one of the PTG areas, the amount that has been claimed was just drawn on a piece of paper. So there was no measurement at all. The amount that was sanctioned in Andhra is very sophisticated. They created the kind of passbook that we showed with the proper boundary, etc. But what was being sanctioned in that process is probably 1/3, 1/4, or 1/5 of what has been claimed. And no way to show that who's right. What the GPS does is, even with a 10% loss of accuracy, is to get as close as reasonably possible to the area, to the status as of 2005, and force the hand of the state. In the process, empower the people because they do it themselves.
I agree. Evidence, definitely. Yeah.
So these are all subject to final measurements and surveys are need to be done. But what you raised another
property.
There are 2-3 things as far as FRA is concerned. One, we must be cautious with that also. Number one is a FRA pata is not a absolute right. Number one, because the FRA, even though in the preamble it says that notwithstanding anything contained in any area, ultimately it says that the status of the land is a forest land used for temporarily, not alienable, and it is hereditary. For all practical purposes, the owner of the forest land is forest department. De facto. De facto is tribal. De jure is forest. Therefore, the Forest Conservation Act also applies. When it comes to utilization of this land, you cannot utilize for horticulture or anything, because FCA, presently if the government, somebody is putting pressure and all these things, presently people are, as far as law is concerned, you cannot use it for horticulture, coffee, tea, like that, as per the Forest Conservation Act. That is number one. Second one, extension of what Mr. Ravi has said, the handheld GPS instrument, I have personally verified when I was a member of the forest committee in Kolleru sanctuary area. There is a variation of 5 meters. 5 meters means you lose or gain. That's a really... The third caution is, once an FRA Pata is given, approved by the district level committee, it cannot be revised. Even if you find after cadastral this thing, a little more he is eligible or anything. That is what it cannot be. So, in Andhra Pradesh also, our people have done a lot of things in a hurry before 2010 elections. So now, even though we are on the top of the table in terms of giving this thing, we are also on top of the table as far as confusion is concerned at the ground level. That is the caution I am telling you. Thank you.
We agree. I mean, this is not a full title. That is, everybody knows that this is not a full title, but this is something which protects the tribals from yearly harassment from the forest department in a big way. Also, it this entitles them to get benefits of the various government schemes, and it entitles them to get compensation when this land is taken for any development projects. So that they have, for all this purpose, central government has considered this as good as privately legally owned titles. That is one thing. So that is fine. It is known. And even private lands in tribal areas are as such non-transferable. 73A Revenue Code applies in all Jharkhand areas also. So that is not for right now at the development stage where the tribal society is. Non-transferability is not a big deal. This titles, if you ask tribals, they want titles. And titles not necessarily transferable. If they are even transferable, they would want. And I don't believe that in this area, at least in Gujarat, I can speak about, even if you get transferable titles, people would lose their lands in a big way. I don't believe that. People are very, very smart, and they know what to sell and what not to sell, and they know how to protect their own lands. So that is not a big deal of issue. What has happened? But because up till now there was daily harassment, yearly harassment, they could not take any developmental works on these lands. Even if they construct a bund, Forest Bidgard would come and break it, say that this is my land, how you have constructed a bund on here. So now all those things would go, and they would buy a...
Are the banks giving them any loan?
Banks, they have not yet approached. Yes, banks, and I don't believe that it has not. It is a confusion, and for getting full title would be that only, that they can get loans from the banks, which right now is not there.
Our recommendation was to the state government that the banks be given a guideline, and banks can give money. I mean, it's not a big deal. It doesn't have to go to the constitution.
The crop loans and other things, and they want to. There are two things that are happening now. As once with this much security and tenure on this land, people are investing in a big way for developing it, irrigating it, going for optimal crops, and so on a limited area, good soils, and remaining lands they are even thinking of doing forestry. Growing bamboos, growing other trees, so that they would be owners of both the bamboos, teak, and also the whatever they grow on their small little plots. So even lands which are right now under cultivation, and no forestry, there also the forest cover might improve if these things go ahead. And remaining of the forest, you have claimed that, as you have said, that this is a community forest, and the responsibility of managing and protecting that forest, which is not really theirs. And that forest was destroyed by the forest department. So why should the tribals regenerate it? That is the basic point. And my only thing is, if the tribals are ensured that they would get the benefits from this, whatever they regenerate, they would be interested in regenerating it. And bamboo gives a big, although under Forest Rights Act, you don't have any right over teak and other main forest produce. Bamboo is included in minor forest produce, and bamboo itself can give tremendous amount of income. You should see and meet the tribals, and they know everything. You don't have to teach them silviculture of bamboo. They know the silviculture of bamboo best. They know which bamboo to cut, which not to cut, how to allow it to regenerate, and what to do when the seeding has happened. Everything they know. So you just ensure them that whatever bamboo you grow, you can sell it to any company or anybody at your own price, and forest department and governments would not have any say in that, and they would do that. They are looking forward to it.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a question on the back.
My question is in the context of environmental Banshee ban. Ma'am, when the judiciary is confronted with the issue of environment and project, and their implementation is, on the other hand, gave foster the process of development. On the other hand, their implementation would devastate the environment. So on what way should judiciary go? I mean, what are the points, on what grounds do judiciary choose to go in a way, whatever, is it their implementation or not?
Does anybody want to attempt answering this?
Yeah.
I think at the very least, rule of law should be followed. At the very least. What is happening in most of these cases is rule of law is being flouted, and what is coming up is personal biases about development and prosperity and what is good for the area. Follow the rule of law, at least at the minimum, stick to that. And if you actually follow many of these cases, that exactly is what is being flouted. And of course, anybody else can add. This is just...
No, good, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you all for a fascinating panel. It's stimulated a lot of questions, and I'll just make a couple. This goes back to the issue of litigation. I know from sort of other kinds of cases that for instance, anti-tobacco litigation and so on, that you find sort of coordination between sort of individual litigants. You have people sort of coordinating and learning across systematically in order to create precisely more effect and more implementation. Is this also happening with this type of litigation? Do different groups and individuals, are there anybody coordinating, learning within states, across states? So that's one question. And related, what about the international environment? Are there international collaboration on this? Is there any learning from what's happening elsewhere? Could you say something about that? And also related, to what extent is this sort of is litigation embedded in other forms of social mobilization around the issues? You were saying something about that, but more generally, is this something that sort of, you said, this is basically lawyers taking the case to the court on their own, it doesn't incur much cost, but that is also maybe making it difficult to sort of sustain pressure over the long term. So what are the efforts to sort of strategically use litigation as part of a broader and more sustained mobilization in these different areas? So that's one complex that I'd like your views on. And then just to the issue of land title, I mean, I know from the discussions elsewhere, of course, that there has been a lot of criticism. You were discussing it briefly, but on land titling also sort of having the adverse effects of creating landlessness. partly because of more or less forced or coerced or tricked sale of, if you own something, you can hand it off. And of course, not all titles can be handed or sold, but so that's one question. But also over time, I mean, not everybody in the community will then have the titles. Some families will have, and some people will have titles, others will not. And which means that the traditional network may be, or maybe not, serving the purpose of a safety net in these societies will be under pressure. Is this something that sort of you're seeing, and is that happening more in some contexts?
Yeah,
Thank you.
It has the parallel in Meghalaya. Exactly.
Yeah, no, this is not only for Gujarat. I'm sort of thinking more generally of these questions, actually, but they came to my mind now.
Panel answers, maybe we'll take one or two more questions. So, Spandana.
Thank you so much to the panel for enlightening us with their experiences through their work. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing their experiences. My question sort of goes to Ms. Kohli. This is sort of related to what Mr. Ravi had said about how in tribal areas there are a lot of like communal disputes because of lack of clear-cut demarcations of lands. So I just want to, I'm asking you especially because of the work that you do with Namati, that this is something, you know, I want to move away from litigation, and I want to ask you what kind of community level alternate dispute resolutions that have come out or that you've seen, do they exist? And if not, are there organizations which are sort of like getting into communities and sort of trying to mediate or negotiate between parties? Yeah, just if you could throw some light on that.
To answer to your first question, a lot of groups, informal coordinations across at least in India, on Forest Rights Act only, there are 2 or 3 groups that are working in coordination. So information sharing is very fast between groups within from one state to another state. That is happening. Not necessarily coordinated action every time. Mainly it restricts because it depends, finally it depends on the groups working in a particular state where they have to figure out when to take up an issue and how to take up an issue. But certain national common concerns are raised at Delhi level, at other levels, at state level. In Gujarat, we have a coordination of about 40 groups working in tribal areas, which are working in close coordination. So everything we are doing, taking actions, we are taking this petition PIL which we filed, that was also part of that overall close coordination which we are working at. So that type of things. With international NGOs, I don't know about whether right now, none of the groups I know, none of them have any. Maybe Culprix having something with some international NGO, but otherwise I don't know anybody having any. That's the thing. Other question?
One thing that Amrish left out, that because of they have this case, this FRA was not their first PIL. They have been involved in court cases for at least 2 decades, and his wife, who was otherwise already working, thought of becoming a lawyer herself so that she can take forward the cases more effectively. But I think, you know, and the judgment, this FRA judgment, I myself may have shared it to at least 100 people, you know, across different states who wanted to get the copy of the Gujarat judgment and its summaries in India. On the international, I can just tell you my personal experience recently on this, exactly on this issue of mineral rights. You know, there's been this whole thing about natural gas in the US, a virtual revolution that has taken place. What to me struck as really interesting and powerful is that the natural gas revolution in the United States in the last 5 years has taken place mostly on private agricultural land, which means that unlike the Alaska issue where the federal government can stop a pipeline or whatever, here the private farmers directly negotiated with the explorers and the oil companies. And the technology has evolved to such an extent that the farmers continue to farm on the land, and the drilling today is vertical and horizontal. So you don't disrupt a lot of land on top. And they get a royalty, which goes directly to the landowner. You know, so to me, the reason why I think law may be important but it's not cast in stone. If society is aware and moves, the law will get changed. And therefore, I'm not so concerned that there are a lot of restrictions on the law, FRA, because I'm not looking for an ideal law. I'm looking for just one more step from where we were. And the next step will follow. Inevitably, it will follow. So we should look at law as a part of the evolution and not a final state given by somebody. Because this is an evolutionary state, and I can tell you, the inability to transfer is not just protecting the tribals. It's also undermining the price and creating local mafia. That is, local power lords, brokers, take over on Benami land from their peers in the community and then take it out, become a sleeping partner with an outside investor. So the corruption is not just one way in terms of the poor farmer or tribal losing out. Restriction itself creates its own cost, and people will have to resolve it. But we are not getting into that because the whole focus has been, let's get this one step going before we come to the other issues.
I'll try and do two quick responses to your two questions and then to the final one. I think a lot of people who are litigating are also part of social mobilizations. So, which is not unique to India. It's pretty much the case everywhere else. So I think that so in many ways, when social movement groups tend to coordinate amongst each other, there are people who have been helping with litigation and who've been part of those processes. They tend to these lines kind of get blurred because each one comes with their own role. So I think that it's pretty integrated. There is increasing international cooperation, including international groups supporting litigation indirectly, etc. That is going on pretty much. So I mean, it kind of all the 3 points tend to get merged. The whole issue of land titles and creating landlessness, I think, is definitely a very clear thought process that has gone on. What happens post the Forest Rights Act? Can actually rights be acquired? How much can it really mobilize? All those kinds of concerns have been raised, even in areas where Forest Rights Act has been used as a mechanism of assertion. We say, it'll give you something to be able to negotiate better when there was nothing more. So I mean, it is the flip side. It can happen. I mean, in fact, recording of rights can immediately mean you know exactly what land is where and what you can acquire, what you can take. I think Bharat Bhai will be in a much better position to answer the question about are there existing alternate dispute resolution mechanisms. My understanding is that there are, but there are mostly in relation to the livelihoods that are prevailing currently there. So, for instance, if you have to, if there's a dispute between a salt pan worker and the fishing community, between the grazing community and the fishing community or the agriculturists, there are alternate dispute resolution mechanisms there. When it's the external, when it's an Adani or an OPG or a Tata Power which comes in, I'm not sure the alternate dispute resolution mechanism, or rather I don't think they work. In terms of Namati, Namati in India is not working on alternate dispute resolution mechanism. We are looking at more environment justice and enforcement issues.
I had two quick questions. One was on dispute resolution, more on community engagement. I would like to ask the panel if they have come across any successful model of community engagement, either due to pressure or from the people or from the government itself, of private organizations involving in good community engagement or sort of good community engagement. And the second question was to the panel and to everyone at large about what are your views on private ownership of resources? Because from what I understand in the Meghalaya panel and the little bit of experience that we had when we had gone there, was one of the reasons of one of the bigger problems of rat hole mining is also because it is private land, privately owned resources, and there have been very little restrictions over there. Similarly, with the shale gas revolution as well, because it was on private land, the government could not intervene for a very long time in terms of the regulations and rules and on environmental impacts. And the only time they did was when there were large-scale negative implications which were very obviously visible. So in that sense, what does the panel think about private right to minerals and resources, and how can individual ownership of resources under the land curb a mafia of any sort still developing, or misuse of the resources and the way they are mined and excavated? Thank you.
Isn't that what you're supposed to find out after 3 years? That's the goal. Should we take another question?
Yeah.
My question to the panel is, like, we come to hear about mostly about PILs with respect to environment law and stuff. So my question is, to what extent this PIL thing is effective for resolving all these disputes and issues?
Yeah, I'll just say on the mineral thing. I personally think it should, under the ground goes to the landowner. And the rest would be taken, I think the Meghalaya, I don't know much about it, but I think there would be environmental costs in many such activities. And it will be up to the community themselves to negotiate to resolve their dispute. And in our case, we have seen the 50,000 plots that have been mapped by Archvahini and that network in Gujarat. There is not one instance so far where the community has not resolved boundary disputes. Given the prospect, recognizing and accepting their capacity to strike a deal in good faith is very high, much higher than most of us would have believed from the outside.
I personally disagree with Mr. Itra on this. So with respect to mineral resources under the soil, different countries have different legal regimes regulating that. The US gives the landowner the right to mineral resources under the soil. Germany does not. The British state in India, that was the arrangement that they established. And I do think that, and I think that obviously different countries have different kinds of social and political circumstances, so you can't really look at them like that. I do think that in developing countries that have scarce resources, and I think that maybe that's the question also I would put to the panel, is that we've heard a variety of views here, but the fact of the matter is that there are some views that haven't come out in this discussion, and that's a very vocal lobby which is out there, which is the industrial lobby, private capital, and so on. And wherever you have scarce resources, if you would give rights over those resources to a select group of people, landowners, I think it would not work out very well for the social good, and would also create regulatory challenges of the kinds that we've heard about in Meghalaya. So I'm not sure that the rights to mineral resources under the soil should belong to landowners, especially when land titles and land records themselves are not clear. There's been so much displacement of people who legitimately did own the land and so on. So that's my personal view on that. But I think that the other question that I hope we can all think about is that how do we resolve, so there's even with respect to the Forest Rights Act, we have the conservationist lobby, which we haven't really heard about, here, and their interests. And then, of course, there's been a lot of criticism that because it's set, and obviously you have to set because you set this 2005 cutoff date, you basically, took away the rights of those who moved after 2005, because any date is arbitrary in that sense. So in any situation, I think that there are multiple layers and conflicting interests even within those. You're empowering one community and you might be disempowering another, even through an enabling law like the Forest Rights Act. And I think with the fisher folk, there's also at the national level, there's a Fishing Rights Act that was being sort of thought about and pushed. I don't know if you want to talk about that. And I find it interesting that this we have a significant rightsification of our discourse today, where everything is every claim is articulated in the form of a right, which kind of talks again to the judicialization of and the of the way we articulate our claims, not as in terms of community activities that you were talking about, more in terms of assertion of a legal right that you can then effectuate. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well. You can have some concluding observations on that and then break for lunch. Yeah.
couple of points over here. As far as this mineral rights on individual lands and versus common, I think this is in a way, not a very fertile debate, because most of our mineral resources are in any case under government lands. Most of the government, so it is all government lands. The question, more appropriate question is whether the local communities should have a say in the use or extraction of the resources, and how much say and how much royalty they should have. So that is the biggest question. Right now, they don't have any say. It is all central government. And whatever extraction takes place, they are at the receiving end of all the negative impacts, and they don't have any benefit from the income that the government accrues from that. So the ownership of the Gram Sabhas, not ownership, or say stake, a higher stake. And if with higher stake also, some Gram Sabhas would feel that we don't want our resources to be extracted. So respect that. But right now, when they don't get anything, so they would say all the time, no. If they have a choice, they would say, don't do this, because in any case, they are not getting anything. If they have a stake, then if they say no, then they would be paying a price of foregone benefits. So they would have an interest to calculate whether benefit cost is proper or not, and whether to do these things in a proper way. But I do believe that...
I think there are two different things though, right? Consulting the local communities in terms of exploitation.
And giving them an important say, because there are these Niyamgiri hills. If the tribals believe that we don't want our hills to be extracted, that right also must be respected. Yes. You can't just impose your decision, which are in the so-called national interest on these tribals. So that is all. So you give the local tribals, local communities a stake, and there would be, in certain areas, tribals would want to go ahead with them. And because they are local, they know the impact of everything that is happening there, they can have better safeguards. Although their bargaining power vis-a-vis industries and other companies would be less. So there can be a role of government involvement in that. But giving them a right to say no. So same with Land Acquisition Act. Land Acquisition Act saying no right remains. Why should you acquire compulsorily for land, for industries, and for even township developments? In Kutch, most of the industrialization that is going on, apart from coastal areas, it is mostly on government lands, say Mudra and other things. But all private lands also, the farmers have negotiated straight with the industries. No Land Acquisition Act. That is the reason why Gujarat does not have many protests against Land Acquisition Act. Although government land is being gifted away in a most brazen manner, and but you don't have, private land is not being acquired compulsorily. So that issue
except
also.
Common property resources,
and there are individuals who are already using those common resources for fisheries, for agriculture, for other things, and all their rights are being nullified, and just private interests together with state power are doing all these things.
I'll just try and respond to 2 points. One on the how effective are PILs. I think there's a lot that goes around the final. I mean, what is the final outcome of a PIL is actually determined by many other factors than what really goes on in court. And I think any one of us who's been part of those dynamics, how positions change. What are the kinds of arguments that are put forward? I think the effectiveness is in terms of an environmental outcome. I think is there are many more factors that influence it than just an issue of law. I think that's so. I think it's a whole area of research and debate which needs to be opened up on that. The other thing is about our private organizations taking on any private. By private, I'm presuming you're meaning industrial and infrastructure projects, doing any good community practice. If you start with the issue of breakdown of social relationships and ecological change, takeover and land use change, then good would really depend on what you consider to be a good life, right? So it's if from an environmental point of view, change of an ecological a place like Kutch where the socio-ecological ethos continues to exist right now, if it's perceived as good, then the land use change will not be good. However, if you perceive as a good process of law that is followed, where people feel engaged and part of a process, that could be considered good. Or a good compensation package could be considered good. So I think in many cases, from my experience, I think the good practice is in the final block, where it's good compensation packages that is beginning to emerge, which is also being demanded. In the few instances where it is good, you get good financial gains, at least for a few people who are being impacted. Yeah.
So I'm afraid we are out of time. So I'll just take this opportunity to thank all the panelists. And I think that many of the issues that have come up are going to be continued in the Andhra panel. And there's been such a lively discussion. So there's going to be, especially on land acquisition, I think Pavan will have things to say about that. And I'm sure Dr. Shastri and Ravi will continue to we'll talk about these issues.
Of course, on mineral rights, there's a lot that is happening.
So please, I'd like to invite you all for lunch now, and then we'll be back in about 45 minutes. And yeah, so around 3 o'clock, and then we'll have the session on Andhra and continue this discussions. Thank you very much.